Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Exploring Marketing Research, Chapter number 16, Part 2. Sampling Design and Sampling Procedures. After studying this part, you should be able to identify the types of non-probability sampling, including their advantages and disadvantages. Summarize the advantages and disadvantages of the various types of probability samples. Lastly, discuss how to choose an appropriate sample design as well as challenges for internet sampling. Probability versus non-probability sampling. In probability sampling, every element in the population has a known non-zero probability of selection. The simple random sample in which each member of the population has an equal probability of being selected is the best known probability sample. Probability versus non-probability sampling. In non-probability sampling, the probability of any particular member of the population being chosen is unknown. The selection of sampling units in non-probability sampling is quite arbitrary as researchers rely heavily on personal judgment. Probability versus non-probability sampling. Technically, no appropriate statistical techniques exist for measuring random sampling error from a non-probability sample. Therefore, projecting the data beyond the sample is, technically speaking, statistically inappropriate. Nevertheless, researchers sometimes find non-probability samples best suited for a specific research purpose. As a result, non-probability samples are pragmatic and are used in market research. Non-probability sampling. There are four types of non-probability sampling: convenience sampling, judgment sampling, Cora sampling, snowball. Non-probability sampling. Convenience sampling refers to sampling by obtaining people or units that are conveniently available. A research team may determine that the most convenient and economical method is to set up an interviewing booth from which an intercept consumers at a shopping center. Judgment purposive sampling is a non-probability sampling technique in which an experienced individual selects the sample based on his or her judgment about some appropriate characteristics required of the sample member. Researchers select samples that satisfy their specific purposes even if they are not fully representative. Non-probability sampling. Researchers select samples that satisfy their specific purposes even if they are not fully representative. The Consumer Price Index (CPI) is based on a judgment sample of market basket items, housing cost, and other selected goods and services expected to reflect a representative sample of items consumed by most Americans. Non-probability sampling. The purpose of quota sampling is to ensure that the various subgroups in a population are represented on pertinent sample characteristics to exact extent that the investigator desire. Stratified sampling, a probability sampling procedure described in the next section, also has this objective, but it should not be confused with the quota sampling. In quota sampling, the interviewer has a quota to achieve. Non-probability sampling. For example, an interviewer in a particular city may be assigned 100 interviews: 35 with owners of Sony TVs, 30 with owners of Samsung TVs, 18 with owners of Panasonic TVs, and the rest with owners of other brands. The interviewer is responsible for finding enough people to meet the quota. Aggregating the various interview quotas yield a sample that represents the desired proportion of each subgroup. Non-probability sampling, a variety of procedures known as snowball sampling, involves using probability methods for an initial selection of respondents and then obtaining additional respondents through information provided by the initial respondents. This technique is used to locate members of rare populations by referrals. Suppose a manufacturer of sports equipment is considering marketing a mahogany croquet set for serious adult players. This market is certainly small. An extremely large sample would be necessary to find 100 serious adult croquet players. It would be much more economical to survey, say, 300 people, find 15 croquet players, and ask them for the names of the other players. Probability sampling. All probability sampling techniques are based on chance selection procedures. Because the probability sampling process is random, the bias inherent in non-probability sampling procedure is eliminated. Note that the term random refers to the procedure for selecting the sample. It does not describe the data in the sample. Probability sampling. Randomness characterizes a procedure whose outcome cannot be predicted because it depends on chance. Randomness should not be thought of as unplanned or unscientific. It is the basis of all probability sampling techniques. Probability sampling. There are four types of probability sampling: simple random sampling, systematic sample, stratified sample, cluster sample. And lastly, there is another type, that is multi-stage area sample. Simple random sampling. The sampling procedure that ensures each element in the population will have an equal chance of being included in the sample is called simple random sampling. Examples include drawing names from a hat and selecting the winning raffle ticket from a large drum. If the names or raffle tickets are thoroughly stirred, each person a ticket should have an equal chance of being selected. In contrast to other, more complex types of probability sampling, this process is simple because it requires only one stage of sample selection. Systematic sampling. Suppose a researcher wants to take a sample of 1,000 from a list of 200,000 names. With the systematic sampling, every 200th name from the list would be drawn. The procedure is extremely simple. A starting point is selected by a random process, then every nth number on the list is selected. Systematic sampling. To take a sample of consumers from a rural telephone directory that does not separate business from residential listing. Every 23rd name might be selected as the sampling interval. In the process, Mike's restaurant might be selected. This unit is inappropriate because it is a business listing rather than a consumer listing. So the next eligible name would be selected as the sampling unit and the systematic process would continue. Stratified sampling. The usefulness of dividing population into subgroups or strata whose members are more or less equal with respect to some characteristic with, whose members are more or less equal with respect to some characteristic was illustrated in our discussion of chorus sampling. The first step is the same for both stratified and chorus sampling. Choosing strata on the basis of existing information. For example, classifying retail outlets based on annual sales volume. Stratified sampling. However, the process of selecting sampling units within the strata differs substantially. In stratified sampling, subsample is known using simple random sampling within each strata. This is not true for chorus sampling. Proportional versus disproportional sampling. If the numbers of sampling units drawn from each stratum is in proportion to the relative population size of the stratum. The sample is a proportional stratified sample. In a disproportional stratified sample, the sample size of each stratum is not allocated in proportion to the population size but is dictated by the analytical considerations such as variability in the stored sales volume. Cluster sampling. The purpose of cluster sampling is to sample economically while retaining the characteristics of a probability sample. Consider a researcher who must conduct 500 personal interviews with consumers scattered throughout the United States. Travel costs are likely to be enormous because the amount of time spent traveling will be subsequently greater than the time spent in the interviewing process. If an aspirin marketer can assume the product will be equally successful in Phoenix or Baltimore, or if a frozen pizza manufacturer assumes its product will suit the taste of Texans equally as well as Oregonians, cluster sampling may be used to represent the United States. Multi-stage area sampling. So far, we have described two-stage cluster sampling. Multi-stage area sampling involves two or more steps that combine some of the probability techniques already described. Typically, geographic areas are randomly selected in progressively smaller, lower population units. For example, a political investigator investigating an election in Arizona might first choose counties within the state to ensure that the different areas are represented in the sample. In the second stage, areas within the selected counties may be chosen. As a final step, the researcher may select blocks or households within the areas, then interview all the blocks or households within the geographic area. Researcher may take as many steps as necessary to achieve a representative sample. What is the appropriate sample design? A researcher who must decide on the most appropriate sample design for a specific project will identify a number of sampling criteria and evaluate the relative importance of each criterion before selecting a sampling design. What is the appropriate sample design? It depends upon the degree of accuracy, resources, time, advanced knowledge of the population, and national versus local project. Internet sampling. Internet sampling is unique. Internet surveys allow researchers to rapidly reach a large sample. Speed is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Sample size requirements can be met overnight or almost instantaneously. Surveys should be kept open long enough so all the sample units can participate. Internet sampling. Major disadvantage is lack of computer ownership and internet access among certain segments of the population. Yet internet samples may be representative of a target population. Target population, visitors to a particular website. Hard to reach subjects may participate. Internet sampling is unique because of website visitors, panel samples, recruited ad hoc samples, and opt-in list. Website visitors. Unrestricted samples are clearly convenience samples. Randomly selecting versus visitors. Questionnaires request randomly pop-ups over representing the more frequent visitors. Panel samples typically yield a high response rate. Members may be compensated for their time with a sweepstakes on a small cash incentive and database on members' demographic and other information from previous questionnaires. Select quota samples based on product ownership, lifestyle, or other characteristics. Probability samples from large panel is possible. Internet samples can be used for recruited ad hoc samples, opt-in list, etc. After the sample design is selected, researcher has to determine the sample size, and researcher has to select actual sample units. And lastly, researcher has to conduct the field work. Thank you. That's all for part 2.